welcome. So you can, if for some reason you can't see the slides, let me know. So yeah, so I just want to talk today a little bit about the cognitive intensive program, some of the research findings that apply to that. And so just going to do a little tour on, what is the premise of the program of Arrowsmith. It's really founded in the concept of neuroplasticity, the concept that our brain is capable of change. It's capable of change across our lifetime, that it's capable of change both the brain functionally and structurally, which leads to changes in the capacity to be able to learn. So that this is the fundamental premise behind our work. And I call this a capacity-based program versus, we're not teaching content, we're not teaching skills, we're fundamentally changing the brain's capacity to learn. And, with SIP, we're working on the symbol relations cognitive function, which I'll talk a little bit about. So if we think about what is Arrowsmith, it's targeted cognitive programs. Symbol relations is one of those, which use this concept of differential stimulation. So the idea is we're targeting the stimulation to specific regions of the brain, and in this case, it's symbol relations. The idea of effortful processing, which means, as you've probably watched your children go through this program, that they master something and then we make it harder because it is forcing the brain to process in an effortful way to strengthen that function. So this leads to structural changes in the brain, which increases cognitive capacity and the ability to learn, which then leads to increased social and emotional well-being, and increased academic and career success. And if people are interested, all of our research studies are on the website. And in fact, this week we added a new one that was presented at a conference in Vienna last week, which was all on this program on SIP. So if we think about what is symbol relations, this is the capacity to be able to grasp concepts and ideas. It's called an association area in the brain, which really means it's the part of the brain that is connected to all other aspects of the brain. So it's a really, really important cognitive function where it really processes, it receives stimulation and information from the outside world, but also internally from the different parts of one's brain to process that input necessary for understanding the world. And these cognitive functions, each one are building blocks that are really critical to learning. And I think symbol relations is one of the most important. And I called it symbol relations because it's really all about seeing connections and relationships that underlie our understanding of the world. So a really, really important function. It's critical for grasping relationships, making connections. It's for processing speed, that quick grasp of information. It's really fundamental for cause and effect reasoning. So really, that deep understanding of why things happen in the world, conceptually, but even in relationships. It's also really important for making decisions, because when we make decisions, if we're making them effectively, we compare and contrast and weigh a lot of alternatives before we come up with what's the one that makes the most sense. It's fundamental to comprehension or understanding what we read, what we hear, mathematical reasoning, so understanding the logic or the why behind math rather than just memorizing mathematical formulas, but really understanding it conceptually and from first principles. And it's that insight or that aha moment, where everything comes together and all of a sudden we understand. So fundamental to really our relationship, not only to ourselves and others, but our relationship to our world. And we look at these cognitive functions across a continuum, where somebody can be gifted in an area, they can have average ability in an area, they can have a mild, moderate, or severe difficulty in an area. And it doesn't really matter where somebody's starting on the continuum. Through driving neuroplastic change, we can move people across this continuum of function. And how do we do this? As you know, with this exercise, we use clocks. And it isn't particularly to teach the individual how to tell time, which usually happens as a result of the exercise, but you know, when I created this exercise, and it was the first exercise that I created because I had this difficulty, it was, how do I get the brain to process relationships and see connections? And based on reading Luria's work, he talked about if somebody has a difficulty in this area, they will struggle with seeing relationships in time. And certainly I had that difficulty. So I created this exercise in making the brain process relationships through using clocks. And I'm really clear that there are probably multiple ways into the brain to stimulate function. And this is the one that we found quite effective for stimulating this activity. And as you know, we have, you know, all the way from 2 hands up to 10 hands, and every different level forces or requires the brain to process more and more relationships simultaneously. It increases the cognitive load, which drives neuroplastic change. So if people are interested, this research document is on our website. It's now a little out of date since we have another study since we put this one together, but it summarizes the research that's been done on Arrowsmith. And, you know, so we've got lots of studies, over 750 students, you know, across multiple schools, multiple countries, and different universities that are investigating the work, and they're all showing similar outcomes. So what are we seeing in terms of the brain? And the imaging research is being led by Dr. Laura Boyd at UBC, University of British Columbia in Canada, and her team, and then Dr. Greg Rose in the United States at Southern Illinois University, looking into the brain to see what was changing. And we've got data now, students in the full year program and students in the cognitive intensive program, because we've been imaging each summer except for this summer because it hasn't been possible just because of the situation with COVID-19. So this is coming out of the UBC lab. This was, the students were in the scanner. This is an fMRI, and we adapted the symbol relations exercise for the scanner. So the students were lying there and having to do a true false in terms of, you know, was the time correct on the clock? So not exactly like the clocks exercise, but the closest we could get to adapting it to having to lie in a scanner where you can barely move. And what the research found was the students, you know, from baseline, so this was before they did the exercise, and 3 months into doing the exercise. So these were students in the full year program. The researchers saw more efficient processing, which is really critical. The idea in the brain is if you're doing a task, and they were doing the reasoning task, you don't want to have a lot of real estate, a lot of areas having to engage in solving that task. And you can see at baseline, there's a lot of yellow. So there are multiple areas that are having to try to figure out that reasoning task. 3 months into the program, much less real estate taken up in the brain to be able to do the reasoning exercise and process the concepts. So, you know, what the researcher, Dr. Boyd, said was, you know, we don't want to always have to be doing maximal effort in our brains. It's like our muscles. If your brain is fit and accomplished at a task, you should be able to dial it down, and that frees your cognitive resources to do other things. So we're seeing, you know, as students go through this work, more efficient processing in the brain. And then this is work coming out of Southern Illinois University, and these were students in the 6-week cognitive intensive program, because when it was in person, it was in 6 weeks versus 8 weeks in the at-home version. And they imaged students at the beginning prior to stepping into the program and at the end of the 6-week program. And the warmer colors are stronger connections and the cooler colors are less strong connections. And what the researcher found over the 6-week program was areas that were kind of underconnected or weak in their connections at the outset actually strengthened in their connections over the 6-week program. And these were really critical areas. So they saw changes in the connections in the default mode network, the salience network, and the frontal parietal or executive control network. And if we think about these are kind of the jobs or the roles of these different networks. So the default mode network is saying, I'm thinking about something. So it's, you're thinking about your world or, an event. The salience network is saying what's important, like what's important, what's relevant, what's critical, in terms of what's going on around me. And then the frontal parietal or the executive control network is saying, how should I respond to what I'm thinking about and what's important and what's critical? And those are the three networks that we're seeing in the symbol relations, the SIP SIP program, are strengthening both within the networks and between the networks. And so, some of the things that these networks, again, are critical for planning, the ability to kind of guide your actions through, setting a goal and working towards that. Cognitive control, which is a process that sort of actively maintains behavior in the service of achieving goals. The ability to take the perspective of another. So again, that comparing and contrasting, be able to step back out of your experience and sort of survey really broadly and be able to take other people's points of view. Self-awareness is part of the combination of these networks through integrating sensory information, emotional information, and cognitive information. So really, really important changes are happening in the brain as students are going through the symbol relations cognitive intensive program. And more activation in these networks is really beneficial to all aspects of learning, because these are really critical networks. And then, so overall, the imaging results for the cognitive intensive, we're seeing changes in brain activation and connectivity, more efficient processing in the brain, and strengthened network connectivity both within and between networks that are critical for these areas, for reasoning, thinking, planning, executive control, and also memory and all very essential. So, the premise of the program is, again, that differential stimulation. You target the cognitive function that you want to strengthen through the application of the program or the exercise. And what we're seeing, it is leading to changes in the brain. And then what's happening as a result of those changes, this, again, is research in the 6-week cognitive intensive program. And this is the research that was presented last week at the conference in Vienna. It was done virtually. All the cognitive areas were reported on. So this is on the Woodcock-Johnson, which in North America is a standardized assessment battery that looks at both cognitive abilities and academic performance. And what we're seeing in the cognitive improvements, so the brain is changing, which is leading to significant cognitive improvements. So they're seeing processing speed is changing. So that quick ability to process and understand, fluid reasoning, cognitive efficiency, which again, we're seeing that efficiency in the brain, perceptual speed, visual auditory learning, short-term working memory, and oral vocabulary. So all of these cognitive abilities improve significantly over the 6-week cognitive intensive program, which makes sense. You're changing the brain, which is driving cognitive changes, and they saw statistically significant academic improvements, which to me was pretty remarkable, given this is only a 6-week program and these students aren't engaged in academic activity. And they saw math fluency, reading fluency, and academic fluency. And fluency means the ability to do these tasks quickly and accurately. So again, processing speed is, to me, flowing over into math, reading, and academic performance in terms of fluency. And then we've also used the symbol relations program in just regular classrooms. So this is so this wasn't SIP, but it's what we're seeing with symbol relations. So these were students in Madrid in Spain that were doing the symbol relations, so the exercise that your children are doing. They did it 40 minutes a day, 5 days a week, so not intense like your students or your children are doing, but for 5 days per week over 3 months. And again, they use the measures they use in Spain. And they found significant improvements in visual spatial reasoning ability, attention and planning abilities, or executive functioning. And this was to be presented this July in Prague, but again, because of COVID, that won't happen, so it'll be presented at a later time. And 2 days ago, we just got the data. So that was done in 2018. So this past year, because the researchers saw the results in Madrid, they decided to do the symbol relations exercise in a grade 1 class. So all the students in grade 1 for 4 months this past year, 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, we're doing the symbol relations reasoning. They're continuing to analyze this data, but the first finding they're seeing is visual spatial numerical ability is changing for these students doing symbol relations in the regular classroom. So we're seeing changes in the brain, we're seeing changes in cognitive domains, and we're seeing changes in academic performance as a result of this work. This was research that was done by Dr. Greg Rose, who's at Southern Illinois University, and this was presented last October at the Society for Neuroscience Conference in Chicago. And this is a questionnaire which you will be getting at the end of the program and at different points. And what were parents observing in their children after, this was I think about 2 or 3 months after they finished the cognitive intensive program. And obviously, we would expect that they've improved in being able to read an analog clock because that's what they're spending a lot of time doing. But again, the parents were observing changes in oral comprehension, in understanding concepts, in engagement with the world, more attending and engaged, use of language, and then emotional intelligence and school performance was significant, but not as much because some of these students had just returned to school for only a month. So we're going to gather data, after several months back in school. But all of these changes that parents were observing line up with the networks that are changing in the brain and with what we're seeing in terms of the cognitive domain or cognitive ability changes on the Woodcock-Johnson. So, different ways of looking at the changes are all lining up to show very similar kinds of changes. And these were just some parents' observations as their children were going through the program. Again, comprehension and understanding, getting or grasping math, enjoying reading because she understands what she reads, being able to ask more relevant questions, understanding concepts, and defending her position. Sometimes we hear from parents that they feel their children now are more able to defend their positions, and sometimes they're not so sure that that's a good thing. I mean, ultimately it is a good thing, but they may now argue a little bit more than they did before. Again, less anger and frustration because they can process information and understand, so they're not really as stressed, and they can take the perspective of another, which is what we're seeing in the network changes. And again, being more aware of emotions in social situations and connect one's emotions to what's actually happening. So again, it's seeing those relationships and connectivity. And then even changes in sporting ability, because that's not uncommon, because the person can understand what they're being asked to do by their coach and then do it, whereas before they might have struggled with processing and understanding the instructions. So, and this is research, again, done at the University of British Columbia with a different researcher, Dr. Kimberly Schonert-Reichel, on social and emotional outcomes. Now, this is on students in the year-long program, but again, we would expect similar changes in the cognitive intensive program. So this researcher was seeing increase in sense of happiness and well-being of students as they were going through the program. Increase in the sense of locus of control, which makes sense because they're now able to see themselves as an agent of change in their own life. They feel like they have control over their life. An increase in Carol Dweck's concept of incremental theory of mind, which again makes sense because you can't really be in an Arrowsmith program without feeling that the intelligence is not fixed. I mean, you're actually driving change in your brain, which can't be compatible with a fixed mindset. So this is growth mindset, believing, that through your own actions, you can actually change and improve your abilities. And then increase in social skills, adaptability, leadership, attention, staying focused, listening, and a reduction in feelings of depression and anxiety. And what was really interesting in this study, which was over, I think it was from November to May, was a reduction in cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So not only were there observing changes in the individuals, and the individuals were observing changes in themselves, but physiologically their bodies were changing because they were experiencing less stress, so they were producing less cortisol. And this is just a summary of the researchers, University of British Columbia, Calgary, and Southern Illinois, all kind of saying very similar things, that that fundamentally saying that they're changing the capacity to learn new things as the students are going through this program. There's a story here about cognitive efficiency, which includes working memory and attention and learning, the capacity to learn new things. And that's where we argued this is a capacity-based program. We're not teaching skills or content, we're changing the brain's capacity to learn new things. University of Calgary, who did research in, I think 2014, said that strengthening cognitive functions presumed to underlie academic achievement deficits improves reading, mathematics, and writing by targeting the cause, the cognitive deficit, rather than the symptom. So again, we're strengthening the cognitive functions. We're not addressing the symptoms, but by changing the cognitive functions, it reduces the symptoms. It leads to the cognitive and academic changes. And then Southern Illinois University, the conclusion is there is neuroplasticity as a function of Arrowsmith training, which generally improves performance. So do precise Arrowsmith cognitive exercises activate and functionally change particular areas or networks of the brain? The answer is yes. So, and this was, I don't know if people know Norman Doidge's work. He's a research psychiatrist who lives in Toronto, who became aware of the work of Arrowsmith a number of years ago and started sending some of his clients that were having problems with insight, that aha piece. When they were in therapy, they were struggling with making progress because they couldn't make those connections. And then as he saw them go through the symbol relations exercise, they started to be able to make the connections and benefit from insight therapy. And he's written the book, The Brain That Changes Itself, and also The Brain's Way of Healing. And this is his comments specifically around symbol relations, as he had the experience of observing a number of his clients go through this work. And he's saying, it develops higher order reasoning and processing abilities, a skill that has relevance across all academic disciplines. And then he, from his personal experiences, he can attest to how it enhances overall functioning and is a very wise choice for a cognitive function to train. This would have a major impact on improved educational functioning throughout the world. And then again, the fact that they train the brain processors that make possible reasoning and rationality is arguably one of the most important positive developments one could imagine for our world with its complex problems. So this is such a key critical cognitive function that that your children are engaging in and improving. And then if I think about, our vision as an organization is really transforming lives worldwide by improving cognitive capacities, and really, what if we could help create a world where everybody has the ability to think flexibly and reason causally? To me, there would be fewer cognitive issues leading to fewer, behavioral issues. People would make better decisions. People would be more compassionate because they could take the perspective of other people. And learning is accomplished with ease and joy. And certainly all of these things were my experience having gone through this program, because I was the first student that did the symbol relations activity, and I did it in the intensive mode. I just didn't know any other way to do it. So I was, the first symbol relations cognitive intensive program student. So to me, this is, is our vision. And then, what do I dream of? A day when this kind of work just becomes a normal part of the journey of education, that every student has access to these kinds of programs within their school system.